Hello, Curran here. This video is about interactive filtering on a Choropleth map by clicking on the color legend. Let me show you what I mean by that. In this video, we're going to make this interactive map where you can click on these different items in the color legend to select and highlight the countries on the map that match the selected item. If you have followed along with the previous videos, Choropleth map and interaction with unidirectional data flow, and you're interested in building this sort of interactivity, then this video is for you. The topics we're going to cover here include making the color legend clickable, implementing unidirectional data flow, highlighting the selected color value in the color legend, componentizing the Choropleth map, and then highlighting the countries using the selected color value. Hello, Curran here. This video is about adding interaction where you can interactively filter the countries shown on the map by hovering or clicking on the color legend. I'm going to start by forking this Choropleth map, and I'm going to add to the name here with interactive filtering. And I'll just clear out the old README here. What I'd like to do here is listen for the hover events when you hover over these circles or the text. So let's do that first. We have our color legend.js, and I think we could just add this to our merged enter and update selection for the groups. So here we can say .on. Actually, you know what? Let's do it on click, so that when you click on one of these, it will filter the stuff shown on the map. And then it will be persisted, so you could zoom in and out, and that selection should keep. So let's use click here. We could say on click, and then pass callback function, where in the body we can just say console.log clicked. Then if I open up the console here, and I click on one of these, it says clicked. And I can also click on the text, and that works as well. It doesn't quite feel right though, because see, my cursor is this, text cursor, and this cursor doesn't change at all. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to tweak the cursor to provide an affordance that these are clickable. Over in our styles.css, let me see if I can just apply this to .tick, our tick groups and everything inside of them. I think that should work. We can say cursor, pointer, and now if we put our mouse over these, see, we get this nice hand here that sort of tells us that something should happen if you click on these. Alright, I think our modifications to the color legend are done so far. We've added this click, but keep in mind what we want to have happen here is that, let's say I click on this 7 here, all the countries that are that color should be sort of shown or highlighted on the map. So what this means is we're going to need to get this information out of the color legend of what thing was clicked on, and then use that in index.js. And this, by the way, is very similar to our fruit bowl click to select example from earlier, where you can click on these fruits and they will be selectable. So let me just do a quick review of how this works, because we're going to use the same pattern. In index.js, this is where we manage our state. And when I say state, I mean, well, the fruits are part of the state because they can change over time, and also our selected fruit is part of our state. And here's our click handler. When we click on one of these circles, it sets the selected fruit to be the ID that's passed in, and then it reruns the render function, which invokes our fruit bowl component and passes in selected fruit. It also passes in the onClick listener, so that in this component we can unpack the onClick listener from the props. That's how it gets into this scope here. And then we can use it on our onClick event. And that's defined right here. See? onClick. We pass in d.id to this onClick callback function that was passed into the props from index.js right here. and it's defined out here in index.js. And what this does is it mutates the state and then invokes the render function again. And recall that this is an instance of unidirectional data flow, where you interact, which causes a re-render. That re-render causes you to see something new, and you can interact again, and the cycle continues. And when you interact, that's where the event listener triggers, and then you change the state based on what happened in the event listener, and then you re-render, and then you need to use the general update pattern because things could change. Data elements could enter, update, and exit. And when you render, that's when you see something new, and perception and cognition comes into play, and then you can decide what to do next with volition and then action, and then you interact, and then the cycle continues. We're going to use this pattern of unidirectional data flow to implement our interactive filtering, where if you click on something in the color legend, it's going to show just those things that fall into that category on the map. What we've done so far is added the event listener. Now we need to change the state. Back in our code here, we can click on an element in the color legend and it appears here as clicked. But this is just isolated to within the color legend component. What we need to do here is make this callback exposed to the outside, and we also need to know what it was that we clicked on. So let's do that as the first step. Let's access D in the callback, and I'm going to say console.log D. And now if I click, see, now it prints out whatever I click on. So if I click on 7, least developed region, that gets printed out. If I click on 1, that gets printed out there. What we need to do next is expose this to the outside, to the index.js that invokes this component. So instead of console.logging D, we can invoke onClick of D. And this here is sort of a degenerate case because it's a function that takes as input D, and then it just passes this D into this other function. So we can just say onClick, like that. But onClick is not defined yet. The idea is that we can unpack onClick from the props that get passed into the color legend component. So when we're unpacking these other props, we can also unpack onClick. But we're not adding it to the props yet when we invoke this in index.js. So let's go back to index.js, and when we invoke the color legend, here is where we can pass in onClick, and we can define onClick in this scope out here. We can say const onClick equals a function that takes as input D, which will be our color legend value. And then in this function, let's do the same. Let's just console.log D. So now if I click on one of these, it outputs, but now this function is defined in index.js, and that means that we have access to our state. It's in the scope of index.js. That's where our state lives. Although, we don't have any state set up yet. So let's create a new variable that is mutable. We're going to change it over time, so we need to use let, not const. So I can say let's call it the selected color value. And I'm not going to initialize this to anything because it's just going to be undefined at first. But then when we click on something, we can set selected color value equal to D. Now we can say console.log selected color value, and I'll just output this as an object so it's really clear that this is the thing that we're looking at. And now if I click, then it says, all right, the selected color value, which is part of our state, has been changed to this value here. All right, we added our event listener, we changed our state. Now we need to implement the render function using the general update pattern to complete this unidirectional data flow pattern. Recall from our fruit bowl click to select example that when you click on this, it sets the selected fruit, and then it invokes this render function. And here's the definition of our render function. It just invokes our fruit bowl component. So I'm imagining that in our Choropleth map example, we can introduce a render function, have it invoke our color legend component, but then also have it invoke a new component for our Choropleth map. And by the way, the render function can be used here because of a JavaScript phenomenon called hoisting. Hoisting is where you can define a variable, but you can refer to it before it's defined in the code. It essentially hoists all the declarations to the top of the file, so you can see any variable from anywhere, but only within the same scope. So back in our Choropleth code, instead of console.logging this, I'm going to delete that, and instead we can invoke render, a function that is not yet defined, so let's go ahead and define it. Let's say const render equals a function. And what should this function do? Well, it should render our color legend for sure, and it should also render our Choropleth map. But the thing is, we've got everything down here sort of tied up in this scope of the .then callback, which is asynchronous, by the way. So load and process runs, it returns a callback, and then this function here isn't invoked until maybe like half a second later after the data loads. So because of this, I think the best way to handle this is to add countries to part of our state, because when the program first runs and loads, countries is not defined yet. But after the data comes in, only then is countries defined, and we have enough information available to set up the color scale and render our color legend. So let's go ahead and move all of this logic into our render function. And in the callback that gets called once the data is loaded, let's set our state to include this data, this country's data. Since all that we're ever using from countries is features, I'm going to just make a new variable called features. And this is also mutable, so we're going to have to use let features, and I'm not going to initialize this. But we can access this features variable inside of our render function. So instead of countries.features, I'm just going to say features.map, and also down here we can just use features like that. And down in the callback, I'm going to set features equal to countries.features, and then invoke the render function right here. Oops, there should be an S there, features. And because this logic here is similar to this logic here, it mutates the state and then calls render, I'm just going to move this up to the top, right next to Onclick. All right, we're getting closer, but this logic here, it just uses the enter selection, and it's not really componentized. What I would love to see is, just like this, color legend g.call color legend, maybe we could have map g.call Choropleth map, and then this would be tucked away inside of a component. But before we go about that refactoring, I would like to just represent the clicked thing as being selected. That would pretty much complete our implementation of unidirectional data flow, at least for the color legend. So what I'm thinking we're going to do here is that when you click on one of these, all the other ones should appear sort of faded out. And that rendering logic can be done inside of the color legend component. But in order to do that, we need to know about the selected color value inside of the color legend component. So one way we can do that is pass in on the props the selected color value. Then in our color legend.js, we can unpack that from the props. So now we have selected color value in scope here. And what we can do here is just assign an opacity attribute on our groups. So on the merged enter and update selections, we can set another attribute. We can say .attr opacity, and we can set this to be a function of D. And what we want to do here is check, is D equal to the selected color value? And here we can use the ternary operator. And I'll just reformat this here for readability. So if D is the selected color value, then the opacity should just be 1, fully visible. But if not, let's set the opacity to be, 0.2. And see that? Now everything is sort of faded out. But if I click on one of these, see now it appears as selected, which is what we want. But we have this problem that during the initial run, everything is faded out because nothing is the selected color value, because there is no selected color value. So I think what we want to do here is we want to set the opacity to be 1 if there is no selected color value, or if there is a selected color value and D is equal to that selected color value. So I'm going to add some parentheses here just for clarity. So we can encode that thought as code here. We could say if there's not any selected color value or D is equal to the selected color value, then set the opacity to be 1. And see that? Now the opacity is set to be 1 initially because there's no selected color value. But if there is a selected color value, like if I click, then it's set like that. And I think there's one interaction that we forgot, which is going back to everything being selected. So let me just quickly implement that interaction. And I'm thinking that if you click on the thing that is currently selected, then it should be set to, nothing selected. And we can do that by just modifying this logic here. So instead of just calling Onclick, I'm going to go back to this format here where we take as input D, and then we call Onclick with D. But what we want to do here is if D is equal to the selected color value, we should pass in null to this Onclick handler here. So again, we can use the ternary notation. If D is equal to the selected color value, then pass null to the Onclick. Otherwise, pass D. Let's see if this works. If I click on, say, 6, and then if I click on 6 again, see, now everything is selected. But if I click on 6, and then I click on 7, it shifts to be, having 7 as the selected one. All right, so we've got our interactions sort of nailed down here. That's great. Going back to our index.js, let's wrap up this loose end of first componentizing the Choropleth map, and then once we've done that, it'll be pretty easy to implement the logic where we should just basically do the same thing we're doing here, where we set the opacity to something small for the countries that don't fall into the selected category. So the logic that sets the color of the countries is here, but I think we've also got some other logic for the Choropleth map up here. Yeah, see, this is where we're rendering the outline. So if I get rid of this, see, it gets rid of that outline of the Earth. And we're also doing the zooming out here. So what I'm going to do first is just consolidate all the logic that has to do with the Choropleth map in one place. So I'm going to put that logic down here. And now all of this logic can go into a separate component. So I'm going to cut this logic out. I'm going to make a new file. I'll call it Choropleth map.js. And then in this new file, I'm just going to paste all that logic there. And now we can go about implementing this as a component in the same style as the color legend. So this is sort of what the first section is going to look like. We can say export const Choropleth map. I'm just going to paste that logic from our color legend and rename color legend to Choropleth map. And I'm not sure yet what we're going to need for our props, but I just know that we're going to have to unpack some stuff from the props. We're accessing G here, but our selection is passed in from outside. So instead of G, I'm going to say selection.append path. And the same thing for SVG. And this nesting is something that we're going to have to preserve. But for now, I'm just going to say, all right, selection.callZoom, and then we're going to set the transform on selection. No, that doesn't sound right. We're going to need an element called G that is a child of the selection. So at this point, I'm going to say, okay, we're going to append the path to our G variable, and then I'm going to use the general update pattern special case for a single thing to define G. So we can say let G equals selection.selectAll G.data, and it's just going to be one thing. So I'm going to pass an array that just has null. And then we can say G.enter.append G.merge G to get the merged enter and update selection. And because we're going to use G later on, we need to reassign G from the update selection to the merged enter and update selection. And this should fit nicely on one line there. So this is how we can use the general update pattern special case for managing a single element to manage a group element that's going to contain both our sphere path for the map and also all the country paths inside of it. Let's move on to refactoring this logic here, which just blindly appends a new path element on each and every invocation. And actually, this is a good place to use the nested version of the general update pattern. For that, we need access to the enter selection. So instead of let G, I'm going to say const G equals this, and I'm going to leave out the merge for now, and I'm going to say const G enter equals G.enter.append G. Now we can access G enter to append our sphere path here, give it a class of sphere, and also append our sphere path, which is not going to change on multiple invocations. It doesn't really depend on the data. So we can just leave this logic like this, and it will only append this path on the first invocation of Choropleth map, but not on subsequent invocations. And I realized that we need access to this path generator, which is defined out in index.js. So I'm going to grab that logic from index.js. Here it is. Projection and path generator are defined. So I'm going to cut that logic from there and then define those over in our Choropleth map component. I'm going to paste those. And we're going to need these imports from D3. So I'm going to grab those from index.js. And over in Choropleth map.js, I'm going to paste all those imports and then just keep the ones that we need, which is GeoNaturalEarth1 and GeoPath. And we don't need select or any of these other imports. And now I'm going to go and remove these imports from index.js because we don't need them over here. So I'm going to remove these two imports from index.js. So let's continue our refactoring of Choropleth map.js. Moving on to this logic here, it looks like we're going to need zoom from D3. So I'm going to go back to index.js, grab that import, and use it over here in Choropleth map.js. And we're also going to need event from D3. So I'm going to add event from here, and I'm going to remove event from index.js. Now all we're left with is this logic here, and we need to close out this function. So I'm going to add an ending curly brace there. And let's see what we need. We need access to features, which we don't have yet in this scope. So I think we can unpack those from the props, and we're going to need to pass those in from index.js. So over here in index.js, Oh, actually, we need to set up this whole call to our Choropleth map component. But just so I don't forget, I'm going to say, okay, we need features as part of our props there. So let's do this. Let's set this up. Just like we have color legend g.call color legend, I'm going to make a new group element called Choropleth map g. Then we can say Choropleth map g.call Choropleth map. And this is where we need to pass in our props object, which has on it features. I'll clean up that white space. But see, Choropleth map G is not defined yet, but up here, this is where we're defining color legend G, and we have this sort of vestigial line of code here. Let me just change this to Choropleth map G. So we're going to append a new group element to our SVG called Choropleth map G, and then append the color legend G so it appears on top. And I think I'll just consolidate these lines. They all have to do with setting up the DOM. I think we have more work to do in Choropleth map.js. Let's see if this logic can actually work if we have everything that we need. So we have features from props. Path generator we have defined here. But here where we're setting the fill, we don't have color scale or color value. And I think these can also come in from the props. So I'll say, all right, let's unpack color scale and also color value. So these two need to come in from outside, from index.js. So going back to index.js, where we invoke the Choropleth map, I'm just going to paste these two in here. Color scale we do have defined. It's set up here. But color value, I don't think we have defined anywhere here, or do we? Let me see. Oh, here it is. Yeah, color value is d.properties.economy. Great. And looking back to Choropleth map.js, we have this d.properties.name. Well, actually, we have this title, which we're going to have to use the nested version of the general update pattern. And this code here doesn't use the general update pattern. It just uses the enter selection, which is going to be problematic for us. So let's go about refactoring this to use the general update pattern. The first thing I'm going to do is comment out this code that adds the title. And then here we need to use the general update pattern. So I'm going to make a new variable called paths, or how about country paths, equals g.select.path.dataFeatures, and that's where that statement can end. And then we can take country paths and say, okay, country paths.enter.append path. We can give it a class in the enter selection. That makes sense. But when we set the fill and the path itself, I mean, that could vary depending on the data. So let's use the merged enter and update selection. So I can say .merge, and we can pass in country paths to merge there. And we can end that statement there with a semicolon. So at this point, things should be working, and they're not. So let's go into debugging mode. So if I open the console, okay, Choropleth map is not defined. All right, I don't think we ever imported it in index.js. So here we can say import Choropleth map from /Choropleth map. All right, we're getting the background sphere, but not the countries. In the console, I don't see any errors. So I wonder why are these countries not showing up? Well, one thing we can do is just in our Choropleth map component, we can just console.log features and just see if this is defined. Yeah, this looks fine. This looks like it's defined properly. We can inspect the DOM and just see if there's any path elements. We've got our background sphere here, but that's the only path that we've got. So somehow our paths are not being generated. So if we just stare at this logic here, something might pop out. All right, I think it's our use of G here. See, G is just the update selection. It's not the merged enter and update selection. So let me just refactor this logic here a little bit, and we can call this one G update. And what we want G to be here and also here, now that I think of it, is the merged enter and update selection. So we can say const G equals G update dot merge G enter. Oh, but we're using G here. We should be using G update there. All right, we've got our countries back, but we've lost our background sphere there. And I think what's happening is that when we call g.selectAllPath, we are inadvertently picking up on this path here. So what we can do, since these already have a class of country, instead of selecting all path, we can select all .country to just select the country paths, and that seems to solve our problem. All right, sweet. We've got our Choropleth map back, but we still don't have our tooltips, which are still commented out here. So let's bring those tooltips back. For this, again, we're going to need to use the nested version of the general update pattern. That means we're going to have access to this enter selection here. So what I'm going to do is introduce a variable for country paths enter equals enter.append path class country, and this is where that statement ends. And then down there we can say country paths.merge country paths enter and set the D and the fill in the merged enter and update selections. Now we can use country paths enter down here where, okay, on the enter selection, that's where we want to append the title attribute, and we can set the text to be this function here. And I think it should still be working now. Okay, great. But, you know, just looking at this, it occurs to me that the path that we want here, we could set it on the enter selection if we use a key function, which would make it, you know, the object constancy thing would be in place where each DOM element corresponds to exactly one country, and that association wouldn't change over time. So let me do that. I'm going to specify the second argument to .data as the key function that takes as input D, and for our country features we can use d.id, the unique ID for these countries. Now we can safely set the D attribute in the enter selection, but we can only do this because we know that the path generator or the projection is not going to change between invocations. Also, in our particular case, we know for sure that the color scale and the color value are not going to change between invocations, so we can also set them in the enter selection as well. The only thing that will change between invocations is the selected item here. So now let's do that last piece of taking that into account when we render all these things here in the Choropleth map. In order to do that, we need to have access to the selected item. So over in index.js, recall that the selected item is tracked in this variable here, selected color value. So this thing here, we need to pass in to our Choropleth map component as a prop. Now over in Choropleth map.js, we can unpack that value from our props, and we can use it to define, what I'd like to do is define the opacity attribute on the countries. So in the merged enter and update selection for the country paths, we can say .attr opacity, and if I set the opacity to be, let's say 0.2, see, everything will be sort of faded out there. That's how I'd like the non-selected countries to appear. So let's figure out which countries are selected and which countries are not selected. So for that, we need to define a function that takes as input D, a country. And we're going to have to use somehow the selected color value. And we want to get at a Boolean, which is this country does it have a color value that matches the selected color value? So for that, and I'm just going to make some more space here, we can say, is the selected color value equal to the color value of D, this country? Meaning, does this country D have the color value that is the same as the selected color value? And if so, let's set the opacity to be 1. But if not, let's set the opacity to be 0.2. Now, if I click on one of these, see that? It highlights the one that you click on. Meaning if I click on 7, least developed region, it'll highlight all of these least developed region polygons. I don't know, it looks like there's a bug though. See that? Australia and the UAE are highlighted even though they don't match that. I think what's going on here is that D.ID is actually not unique. Yeah, I remember from another project that there's a couple of -99 values for D.ID. So because they're not unique, I think that's messing up the general update pattern here. So what I'm going to do is scratch that. We're just going to go back to index-based, which is the default. If you don't specify a second argument to .data, it just uses the index of the data element to come up with the mapping between path elements, in this case, and our data elements. The implication of this, though, is that we have to set D and fill in the merged enter and update selection, which we can do. We just move that logic back there. Get rid of this extra semicolon. Let's see, does it work correctly now? If I click on 7, okay, now we're getting only the countries that are in this category of least developed region. And if I click on it again, it deselects everything. Okay, we're having the same problem we had before with the color legend, where if there is no selected color value, then we should sort of treat everything as being selected. I'm going to use the same solution I used earlier, where if there is no selected color value, or the selected color value is the color value of D, I think that should work. Yeah, see that? It works. And again, I'll just add parentheses here. I just feel like adding parentheses to make the grouping more clear. Just to go over this one more time, how this works. If there is no selected color value, meaning the state we're in right now, we haven't clicked on anything, nothing is selected, then, in this case, use 1 as a value for opacity. And we want to use 1 for a value of opacity, meaning it looks like this, they're not see-through at all, if there is no selected color value or the selected color value is equal to the color value of the country that we're dealing with. So if I click on, say, 7, then the value of opacity is just being determined by this logic here. Is the selected color value the same as the color value for the country that we're trying to figure out the opacity for? If it matches, meaning if the country falls into the selected category, then we use an opacity of 1, and that's what these highlighted countries are here. Otherwise, we use an opacity value of 0.2. So that's how we can do it. That's how we can set the opacity values for our countries. But to make this pop even more, I think I'd like to set the opacity value on the background sphere as well if there is a selected color value. So here's our logic where we're appending the path for the sphere. What we want to do is set the opacity on this, but we need to use the merged enter and update selection for this path here. So for this, I'm just going to sort of re-indent here So on enter, we're appending the path, setting these attributes, and then we want to merge. We can say .merge with the update selection for this path. And we can access that from gupdate.select.sphere. This will select the existing sphere path. And so on here is where we can set .attr of opacity to be a value that depends on selected color value. So if there is something, anything selected as the color value, then we want to set the opacity to 0.2. Otherwise, we keep it at 1. Now, if I select one of these, then it fades out like that, and it appears as highlighted. I think I'd like to make this even more faded. What if we try 0.1 here? How does that look? Yeah, I think that looks a little better. I'm noticing a problem, though, that for these lighter colors, it's really quite difficult to see that they are selected. All right, so our objective here is that when we select one of these, we should add a very noticeable stroke around these selected countries, these highlighted countries. So we can apply similar logic to what we have here for the opacity to a different attribute, namely the stroke. But the thing about the stroke is, I think we're already setting it in the CSS. Yeah, see right here? This is where we're setting up the stroke. So let's do this. Let's stick with CSS for setting up the stroke. And what we can do is give the countries that are highlighted, like these here, a new class, let's say highlighted, if we should apply this new stroke. So back in our Choropleth map, we can use the classed function of D3, classed, and I'm going to get rid of this logic. We're going to rethink it. We're going to set the class of highlighted, and the way classed works is the first argument is a class name, and the second argument is a function that takes as input D and returns a Boolean value. And if that Boolean value is true, then this class is applied to the DOM element. So first of all, we're going to need to use the selected color value. And it's highlighted if there is some selected color value and that selected color value is equal to the color value of the country that we're looking at. So this is the logic that we need here. So we're going to give the countries a class of highlighted if there is some selected color value and that selected color value matches the color value for this particular country. So armed with this new class, we can go back to our CSS and we can say, all right, the countries that have a class of highlighted, and now we can tweak the stroke and the stroke width just for those countries. And I think the only thing that really should change here is the stroke width. So let's make the stroke width of like 5 pixels, just to be extreme, so we can check if it's working. So if I click on one of these, all right, now they have, well, that's too extreme. Let me make it maybe 2 pixels. And it's already black, so I don't need to specify that there. How does this look? It looks okay. I feel like it's still too thick. What if we just make it 1 pixel? That should be fine. Yeah, that looks decent. All right. I think I'd just like to make it a little bit more faded. So I think for the countries, I'll use an opacity value of 0.1. And for the background sphere, I'll use an opacity value of 0.05. And if you wanted to take this further, you could even, make these props. But I'm not going to do that right now. I just want to get it to look right. All right, that looks good to me. You can still see that there's a map there in the background, but now it's really in the background. All right, so now clicking on these different categories, you can very clearly isolate these visually to read exactly what they are. And panning and zooming still works, by the way, and so do tooltips. So we could do something like zoom into Europe and scroll through here and see, you know, where do the European countries fall. Looks like they're all developed regions, but they're differentiated by G7. And now that we're zoomed in, these strokes really don't look good at all. I'm just going to make the stroke width, let's say 0.5 pixels for the highlighted countries. Yeah, that still makes them pop out enough, but also you can zoom in. That looks reasonably okay. All right, that's it for interactive filtering on a Choropleth map by clicking on a color legend. Thanks for watching. Take care.